Welcome to the Three Wise Men of Divorce, Money, Psych, and Law podcast. Sit down with the California divorce experts, financial divorce consultant Mark Hill, psychologist Scott Weiner, and attorney Shawn Weber for a frank and casual conversation about divorce, separation, co-parenting, and the difficult decisions real people like you face during these tough times. We know that if you are looking at divorce or separation, it can be scary and overwhelming. With combined experience of over 70 years in divorce and conflict management, we are here for you and look forward to helping by sharing our unique ideas, thoughts, and perspectives on divorce, separation, and co-parenting. So, Scott, you're familiar with Paul Simon?
I am indeed.
He's got that song, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover.
Right. Well, I mean, and he's not an attorney
No.
that I know about. And I'm going to guess there aren't actually 50 ways to leave one's marital partner, but there are probably 50 different situations that we could discuss that would divide themselves sensibly into the 3 or 4 ways. And since you're this busy practicing family lawyer mediator guy, what are those ways, Shawn?
Well, there's probably 4 or 5.
All right.
And I call them marital statuses, 4 or 5 different statuses, legal statuses.
Okay.
So, when you get married, there is the legal status of a married person. And at least in California, that there's only one type of marriage. I believe there's some states that have been experimenting with concepts like covenant marriages that are like harder to get divorced from. But for most people in most jurisdictions in the world, you can just get married and that's your status, which means that you're tied at the hip with this person in some fashion or another.
Should we back up one step first?
Sure.
Are there certain kinds of commitments that occur marriage? Does engagement have any kind of status? Do premarital promises or agreements or property ownerships
or cohabitation for many years, does that create another environment?
Well, for the longest time, you had this thing called the putative spouse or the common law marriage. You would hear people talk about, and if we just the idea was
Marvin.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, the idea was if we're going to live together for a while and pretend we're married, then that means we're married, right? And that actually came about back in the days when it was harder to necessarily get married. You might be on the plains of Nebraska and decide that you're going to get married, and so you don't have a legal status of marriage because where are you going to find a preacher, from your covered wagon who could, or a justice of the peace who could solemnize your marriage and issue a marriage license. And so you had a lot of folks that just lived together and pretended to be married, and then that meant they were married.
So those were common law marriages, correct?
And those are out of favor now in the majority of the jurisdictions, that there are no such thing. At least in California, there's no such thing as a common law marriage. You have to actually have a legally solemnized marriage in order for it to be a marriage under California law. But you could check from state to state to see if there's such a thing as a common law marriage. Now there's this thing of well, we're going to live together. Okay, and I can't tell you how many people come into my office and they expect to have the same kind of marital protections that a married person would have, but they never solemnized the marriage. They never had a marriage. It was always just we're roommates, and that's just a person that just happens to live with a roommate. Doesn't matter whether you have a romantic relationship or even had children. You do not have the rights of a spouse. You might have rights as far as child support and parenting are concerned, but you do not have the rights of a spouse when you just live with somebody.
But a court could level duties by virtue of paternity and maternity.
Well, right. So you make a baby together, there could be child support obligations or there could be parenting obligations. But there's not going to be any spousal support. There's no community property.
Okay.
So then you mentioned Marvin.
What if one of you is paying the mortgage on the house that the other person owns?
It's just a civil.
And you didn't get married. It's a gift,
civil,
or can it be recovered?
Maybe.
You lawyer, you.
Really? Give us
Yeah,
an answer, will
it's
ya?
a civil partnership, in other words. So say you got this house and I mean, most of the time if you have a house and you're nice enough to pay somebody's mortgage, that's going to be considered a gift. But you can also have situations where you make a promise. I promise you that I will pay the mortgage. In exchange, you promise me that I get some kind of ownership. And that can be a reliance argument. We call it detrimental reliance. I relied on this to your detriment. You remember this from law school, Scott.
I do.
Collateral estoppel, they call it, where you relied on a promise, whether it was written out or not. And then there could be some kind of redress there, some kind of remedy. A lot of times we'll do what's called a cohabitation agreement, which I actually recommend for folks that are moving in together, because it requires you to have the conversation about what your financial picture is going to be, who's going to buy the furniture and who's it going to belong to when you're done. Otherwise what you have is just a civil partnership and maybe not even that, because if you don't write it down, you also remember, Scott, from law school, the statute of frauds.
Yes.
And if it's over a certain dollar amount, or if it goes for a certain length of time, if it's not in writing, you don't have a contract.
Right.
So having a written understanding agreement between two people that are living together is actually a really smart policy. But then you can have this thing that you mentioned, the Marvin action. Lee Marvin, we can thank him, the actor, for this.
Yes.
And this is where a woman went to take care of him, a rather young and attractive woman went to take care of him. And he allegedly, according to her, made promises that she would take care of him physically and provide certain quote unquote services if he would take care of her after, for her, that he would take care of her and she wouldn't need anything. And the court found that there really is a cause of action for this Marvin claim, where there's this promise where she relied on him to her detriment based on a promise that he made, and that he would owe her that money. The problem is she lost. Once the court found that there was such a claim, now called the Marvin claim, but she ended up losing the case. The court did not find that there was actually such a promise in the Marvin case, which is kind of interesting little statistic there, little trivia. But yeah, I mean, most people, it's either you're married or you're not. And if you're not married, then maybe there were some promises and you have to prove that there were promises.
Okay. So let's go to the next level and presume or assume that by hook and by crook, these people have become married.
They managed to tie the knot.
They tied the knot, and now they've come to a different point of view.
So there are a couple of different boxes, at least in California, that you can check for how to end this marriage. And the one most common that you hear is divorce because of irreconcilable differences. It used to be that California and most of the jurisdictions in the country were a fault state, which meant somebody had to be at fault. There had to be grounds for the divorce, like adultery or cruelty or something like that. But so now all you have to do is you just say irreconcilable differences.
So you don't have to chase around bedroom windows with
in the old days,
cameras and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, in the old days, you would hire a prostitute to go in, and somebody would decide, I'm going to be at fault, and you'd go into that hotel room and somebody take pictures of you going in there, and then, okay, I'm at fault, we have grounds for divorce, it's adultery, we can get divorced. Stuff like that would happen. But now you don't have to worry about that. It's just irreconcilable differences. There are a few states that have fault in their family code, but there are fewer and fewer of them. And so it's usually no fault, meaning you just have to show some kind of irreconcilable differences, and you don't have to show grounds. You don't have to ask permission to get a divorce. You can get a divorce. There's another ground for divorce based in incurable insanity. I think they've cleaned it up in California. It's now permanent incapacity. The inability to make decisions on yourself. And this happens when people, I call this the Alzheimer's divorce. Somebody is so far gone that they cannot be cured mentally. you could get a divorce, but you have to prove that. And I've never in my career have I checked that box. It's always been the irreconcilable differences because that's just so much easier. And then maybe you don't want to get a divorce at all. Maybe you don't want to ever have been married.
How hard is it to get one of those?
I can make you a virgin again if we can show grounds. It's called a nullity or an annulment. You know, and sometimes people get confused. I want to get my marriage annulled, and what they really mean is a divorce. But when you get an annulment, it means that the marriage never happened. And you have to show grounds. So it could be that there was fraud in the inducement to get married. You never solemnize the marriage in the bedroom. That could be one, or the incapacity to perform as a married couple, doing the act of consummating the marriage never happened or was impossible to happen. Or there could be fraud in the inducement. You said, you know what, you marry me and I am a Nobel Prize laureate and I'm quite wealthy and you will want for nothing. And then you marry this guy and you find out that he's a crook and he's not been honest and he's never even been to Sweden, let alone get the Nobel Prize. You could get an annulment if you can show that in the inducement to marry this person, you were defrauded. And there could also be, maybe you find out this person doesn't have the capacity to consummate a marriage. Physically is incapable of consummating the marriage and doing the act that most married people do. Or something like that goes to the heart of what it is to be married. He told you that.
Sounds like it's tough to get.
It's tough to get. You got to show grounds.
Yeah.
And so most of the time
what if you say, I never consummated the marriage, and the other person says, well, yes, we did. Where do you go?
Well, you got to show proof. I don't know how you show proof.
Really?
A physical examination? I don't know.
I don't think that would work. You would probably need almost to get some sort of covert or overt agreement from the other party to engage in that arrangement.
Yeah, I've only ever had one contested nullity that I actually contested at court, and that was over a fraud case. He did not tell her he had herpes. Told her he was clean, and it turned out he had herpes and gave her herpes. And she was able to get an annulment, and then she sued him in civil court for battery.
Right.
But most of the time there has to be some agreement on part of the party. So they might agree, yeah, we never consummated the marriage.
For the non-lawyers listening, battery does not need to be some sort of violent beating. It's an unconsented touching of any kind. You can be charged with battery if you slap somebody's dog when they're walking the dog, if the leash is attached to that other person, and it's battering the person.
Yeah, I mean, it's a marital tort. We could have a whole other podcast episode about marital torts, and one of the famous ones is you give somebody an STD.
Yeah.
Whether it's an annulment or a real marriage. The other way you can get an annulment.
You have to be aware.
Yes,
that you're doing it because
that's
well, in this case there was evidence. There was evidence that he knew he had it at the time that they got married.
Yeah, I mean, you that's where it gets interesting, really. If you are unaware that you are harming the other or that you are doing some sort of that's different. If you are aware and you do not make the other person aware that your touch could have harm attached to it, then
that's different. Or what about fraud is a very loaded tort. That's a very loaded term, and that means you were a bad person. It's not just, I didn't realize that I was fooling this person. You had to know what you were doing, and you have to have intent. But there is also negligent battery with STDs too. Like I referred somebody and they got a pretty good award for a negligent transference of HIV. It's always the men that do this for some reason. I wonder why that is. But this guy was having sex with people every night, several different, partners, multiple genders, and lo and behold, he brought an STD home to his wife. That was, even though he didn't know he had it, it was at least considered negligent that when you're sleeping around that much without protection.
I had a case where the wife was an unknown to herself asymptomatic herpes carrier and infected the husband.
Yeah.
She literally didn't know. I totally believe her, so.
Well, and there's those situations. So you look at all these cases, and it's in those domestic torts, it's an issue of what can you convince a jury, right? But back to what our topic is of these marital statuses. The other way you can get a nullity, and then I'll get off of this issue, is it was illegal when you entered into it. Like you married, you had another wife, and then you got married.
Right.
Right. Polygamy, that's a void marriage. You were never married to that person.
How about finding out that one partner was underage in a given state or something like that?
Yeah. So if the marriage was not legal when it happened, it's void. And
how about if you were married by somebody who really was not capable of, who was not licensed or not, in the state?
What do you mean? You mean not licensed in the?
So somebody who failed to complete their Universal Life Church priesthood or whatever it is, to marry.
Oh, the person that married them.
Yes,
that's operating under color of law, and you probably are okay there. I don't know. I've never seen that before.
Well, yeah. I'm just imagining, and
like it happens to be. Yeah, like you intended to be married. Everybody was behaving honestly. The person that wasn't behaving honestly was the officiant.
Yeah, somebody who decided he was going to officiate because, he thought it'd be cool.
That's interesting. I've never seen that come up, but
let's move on, guys.
It takes a weird mind to...
So let's talk about other things.
Let's talk about the things we tend to see more often.
I was going to say the nullity is very rare.
I've never had an annulment in my 20-year career of doing this.
You probably haven't. So. Well, yeah, I mean, they're rare, right?
Yep.
And what we usually see is either a divorce
or
a legal separation.
Right.
And sometimes people use those words interchangeably, but they really are two different terms. And they're legal statuses of marriage. And really the only difference between the two of them is with the legal separation, you're still married.
What duties remain, or what rights of reliance remain in a separation that are terminated in a divorce?
The only thing is that you can't remarry. Yeah, and you may be able to, depending on insurance companies and fringe benefits and things like that, you may be able to share benefits or...
But one thing people need to be careful about is to talk to their employer before assuming that a separated spouse will be covered under the benefits program.
I've seen more than one sad ending with that, where they went through all the trouble to get a legal separation, and then they were dropped from the health insurance policy anyway because they didn't check. Yeah.
One thing I'll say is we see a little bit less of this since Obamacare came in and pre-existing conditions. It's not something that insurance companies can turn down people for. We used to see a fair amount of it where people would actually stay married, do the whole thing, kind of get this settlement really in place, and then stay until one of the spouses reached 65 and could then go on Medicare.
I always find there's two classes of reasons why a person would get a legal separation over a divorce. And the first one might be for a financial reason, right? Like health insurance or something like that.
Yep.
Or, they still want to be married, but they don't want to share debts anymore because, I've had husband's a gambling addict. So wife wants to have a legal separation. So she's not going to be on the hook for his debts kind of thing. The other reason is religion. Yep. Or just kind of an emotional reason. But, God frowns on a divorce, but I can't be in a financial relationship with this person anymore. I need to have a separation of some kind, but I still want to be married. So that a lot of times people do a legal separation for that reason. But I'd say 9 times out of 10, it's because of money.
There's one more. One more, which is that there are so many times when people aren't quite sure they're ready to totally
go all the way,
pull the trigger and just be done, and there's kids and there's, and there's the household, and there's, I mean, the kinds of things that people who aren't even considering divorce deal with in terms of their own day-to-day stability. I'm older than you guys. We're talking about downsizing house, and because I'm all kind of crippled up and making it up and down the stairs all the time. I'm fine with it. My wife is worried that I won't be able to make the stairs in some number of years.
She doesn't want to clean up your body off of the floor of the stairs when you fall.
I think she's actually more concerned with her own psychology, which is that she's so tempted to push me down the stairs, and she doesn't want the guilt and the shame sitting on.
I did forget about that. That's another way to end your marriage.
Really? Well, yeah, there's that.
Till death do us part.
Well, okay.
Don't recommend it, though.
That's what you recommend.
We do not recommend that. I don't think that's a legally viable option to murder.
It's not a good way to get the life insurance proceeds.
No, there you are. Weber dispute resolution frowns upon that approach.
we frown on murder.
Yeah. Let's not talk about who killed who.
I tell you what,
this is a wedding.
We're laughing, but I've actually had cases where people have done that, and it's not good.
I've had cases where I had a lady once who drove her car into her husband's living room, trying to get him. He was actually in the dining room, and he survived. She literally drove right through the front window across his lawn.
Yeah, I've had attempted murders, and I've had one actual murder. It was pretty awful.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Okay, so let's move on
stuff.
to what we tend to see and the reasons behind it, which, as you say, are financial.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Mark, there's one other thing that people usually don't think about, and that is that you don't have to do either. You could do an agreement that says, we want to stay married, but we need to rearrange how we're doing the finances.
A postnuptial
agreement. It's like a prenup in reverse.
I almost never hear about this one. This is great. People need to hear this. Talk about it.
Well, I mean, it's basically a contract, whereas the other two options are enforced as court orders. This is a contract that just says, we're going to stay married. We actually intend to, by this document, to strengthen our marriage. And this is how we're going to arrange our finances so that we can have a stronger marriage. I always tell people, everybody's got a prenup. It was just either you wrote it yourself with an attorney of your choice, or you a legislator in your state legislature wrote it in their family code.
Right.
And so you can modify the family code to fit your need. So maybe it doesn't work for you to make community property when you earn money. Maybe you want to make it so that all of your wages are separate property. You can do that with a postnuptial agreement.
So you can actually contract your way around the community property law if you are explicit in your terms.
Or make it how you want it to be,
Boy,
we agree that if we I did this on a case a couple months ago. We agree that this specific piece of real estate, regardless of what we put into it during the marriage, will be 75% the wife's and 25% the husband's. And we agree that this business that husband started during the marriage is 100% separate property of the husband. And that's what they want. They agree to it.
But in doing that, wouldn't you want both of the couple to have at least their own, if we were to be mediating it, their own consulting attorney, so that they, I've heard cases where prenups were delivered, on the church steps, and it turned out to be invalid because there wasn't proper representation or time.
Well, yeah, when you talk about the Uniform Premarital Agreement Act, Mark, which is what most states are following in some form or another, it's virtually impossible to draft a prenuptial agreement that is enforceable without having attorneys on both sides reviewing the agreement, signing off on it. And that's certainly the case in California. And similarly, even though it's a different area of the family code that governs postnuptial agreements, it's very hard to draft a postnuptial agreement that will be enforceable without attorneys reviewing it. So it's in both parties' interest to make sure that there's attorneys. Doesn't mean that you have to be fighting attorneys, though.
True.
And
Well,
we
that's
do
the
a
other
lot of
thing.
it. Yeah, we do a lot of it with alternative dispute resolution, where people.
I think that if you're considering these different options, the way to go is ADR, because
I think it
candidly,
is.
it's difficult to have these conversations in an emotional relationship that you plan to maintain on the same level. And it could well undermine that if you have this traditional adversarial attorneys positioning on behalf of both sides.
Well, and I had a case that I just finished up a couple of months ago. It's the one I was telling you about. They had worked with attorneys. It looked like it was going to be a divorce, and it was pretty nasty litigation. And then they both kind of talked to each other and said, we don't really want to end our marriage, but we want to have a different arrangement. And so then they hired a collaborative practice team where they had two collaboratively trained attorneys. They had a financial specialist, and they had coaches on both sides, mental health professionals, helping with the emotions. And we worked together to come up with a postnuptial agreement that was better than anything a court could have ever done for them, and is what they wanted. They stayed in charge, and it was a wonderful agreement. I have every reason to believe that it's going to be a lasting agreement.
A word to the wise to you folks, whoever's listening to this. This can occur. You actually can negotiate these things, even though at the front end of it, it might look impossible. Really, what we do when we're doing this collaborative stuff and this ADR, alternative dispute resolution stuff, is we start from the posture that most people start from, which is that, okay, these are the positions people are taking. And we break that out into the interests of the parties. What do you really need? What's really best for you? What can you easily actually afford to give to the other party to make them whole? It's a much better way.
But what happens, guys, if I decide I'm not sure I want to get a divorce, but I get a legal separation, and then down the road I go, no, this is not working. We should have divorced. How does that impact things?
Well, it depends on how far along in the process you got.
I'm finished. I got the legal separation. I was there, but then she just did it again, and I was done. I'm done with it. Do I got to start over? How does this work?
So what you do is, at least in California, you have to refile with a new case number for now a petition for dissolution of marriage. But then what you typically do is you just take that judgment of legal separation, you paste it right into your judgment of dissolution of marriage. And the only thing that's changing is now the marital status is ending.
So that's a conversation
Shawn,
that I've find that it gives them a level of comfort that they're not going to have to do it over if it doesn't work out. And if you make it clear that, from my standpoint as the financial neutral, my work is identical. Yeah. Nothing I'm doing changes. It's really only the legal work. And so it's not divorce light. It requires exactly the same amount of effort as you would put into doing a divorce. The only difference is that you can maintain that marital status for whatever reason it's important to you.
I have a question. Does this mean that most or all legal separations are as thoroughgoing in terms of the terms as a divorce in fact would be?
Absolutely.
So people don't do legal separations that are what I will call for the moment partials, where
well, they might, but it would come back to bite them if they did and they ended up divorcing.
We've seen that done where people did partial things, and then the court reserved jurisdiction over the rest of the case so that if they needed to decide something, they could. I don't generally recommend that. What I like, it's kind of like being half pregnant.
Or maybe I'm confusing legal separation with say like a postnuptial agreement that would do some of the terms but not all of the terms.
So a postnuptial agreement, you could just say, the only thing we're going to talk about here is the status of husband's business.
I get it. Okay, thank you.
Or you could say we're it depends on your jurisdiction, but in California, there's a split on authority on whether or not you can limit spousal support in a postnuptial agreement the way that you can with a prenuptial agreement. So that's just a little thing to think about. Like if limiting spousal support is something you want to be concerned about, you might want to go ahead and go all the way to the legal separation. But yeah, I mean, you're just as thorough with the legal separation as you are with the postnuptial agreement typically. And it has the same force in law as a dissolution of marriage would have.
And there's child support if
everything
required.
is there. Yeah.
Everything's the same.
All the required stuff. The only thing that's different is that you're still married. Now, that said, you're also still married. So if you want to get remarried, we have to do a divorce. And I had that happen. I did a legal separation for this couple, and the guy came back to me later and had told me that he had remarried. And I'm like, well, how did you remarry did you do a divorce? Well, no. I thought we did that with the legal separation. No. You're not. So you didn't remarry. You have a void marriage that you need to remedy this.
Yeah.
So how many fees did you get to charge? Never mind.
Oh, I made a good amount of money off of this unfortunate man who didn't take my advice.
Oh, my goodness.
I find that when people don't take my advice, they end up spending more money.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this gentleman had really done it wrong.
So if someone's considering this, how would we advise they go forward? First of all, it takes two to tango. So you've both got to be comfortable with this. If one wants a divorce, it will be a divorce.
Yeah.
But if you're both of the same mind, or there is a valid financial reason for doing it, is there any difference in the way the couple should approach this, Shawn?
Not really. I mean, I think, if you haven't filed something at court because you're doing a postnuptial agreement, you don't have the same disclosure requirements that are, like certain particular forms that need to be filed at court to say that you've done your disclosures. But in order for the agreement to be enforceable, you have to show somebody later that you've disclosed everything. So I tend to use similar forms. Mm-hmm. It tends to feel very similar to any other case. It just depends on what they want to do. And I find that, the financial piece ends up being very important because a lot of it's planning. What do we want to do with our money and how do we want to do it? Almost a bigger piece is the emotional side of it. Well, why are you doing this? Why aren't you just getting a divorce as opposed to staying together? And do you want to try to work on your marriage? Do you want to stay together? What do you want your marriage to look like?
Right.
I think that in a long-term agreement of any kind that is either a post-nup or even anything shy of a divorce, the kind of trust that you're going to need to have between those parties as they work out terms, they're going to stay involved with each other, even in a legal separation, if they're partially going to stay connected. You better have trust. You better have that going on, because you're going to be protecting yourselves from,
well, I would say
trust will protect you.
Trust but verify. So we have the trust, but we should do the disclosures.
Well, you're going to do the disclosures anyway.
That builds trust, doesn't it? Yeah, you have to. And even for a postnuptial agreement that ends up, you need to have the disclosures. Otherwise, somebody can come back and say, well, I was induced to make this agreement, and there was fraud in the inducement because something wasn't disclosed.
Well, I'd say something that I think that legal separation actually requires more detail in the agreement, because there's so many sort of gray areas. Are you still cohabiting? If so, how do you agree to pay for an improvement to the house? What if one side wants to do it and the other doesn't? Okay.
You're going to continue to own joint assets?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's very often what does occur, especially if they'll co-own the house. They may separate other parts of their finances, but they want a legal separation for religious reasons or to get the kids through school or, whatever.
I would say that most of my legal separations, they end up separating everything.
I've had them co-own property. Yeah.
But I have, like I was going to say, I have had them co-own. And if that's going to happen, then it's as if they're two the way the law will look at their arrangements, it's two unmarried people that are co-owning property is the way, even though they're technically still married, they still have that status of marriage.
They're joint tenants.
Maybe they're joint tenants, and do they want to continue to be joint tenants, or do they want to have a tenant in common? And by the way, the difference there is the joint tenant is an automatic right of survivorship, whereas tenants in common, you may not. Automatic right of survivorship means that the person that lived and survived when the other person died gets everything. Mm-hmm. Whereas a tenants in common, you could still will your share to somebody else. Huh. Well, there's a lot of stuff here, guys. I mean, we can keep going.
There's a lot.
So if somebody wants a legal separation but is charged with the emotional problems that might bring, how would they contact Scott Weiner?
Oh, they pick up their trusty telephone, in my instance, not being a website guy. And it is Scott Weiner. I'm a psychologist, inactive in the bar, but law trained also. I get good advice from Shawn if ever I need it. And Mark certainly knows the financial ropes back, forth. And even though he's British, my God, do you do it in pounds sterling? No, I'm just wondering.
Pounds, shillings, and pence.
Pence. Very good.
If you're old enough to remember 20 shillings to a pound, 12 pennies to a shilling. And why did we do that? Because it could be divided by 3 equally in a way that you can't. Good. I know. We were so smart. But then we bowed to continental pressure and gave up, went decimal.
Almost like feet and inches. All right. Scott Weiner, 619-417-5743. And I do answer my own phone, ladies and gentlemen. And Mark, how in the world do I contact you?
You would go to my website. The company name is Pacific Divorce Management, and the website address is pacdivorce.com, PACDIVORCE.com. Shawn, are you reachable?
I am very reachable, and the best way to get a hold of me if you want to resolve any kind of dispute that you have is WeberDisputeResolution.com. That's Weber like the grill with 1 B, WeberDisputeResolution.com. Thanks for listening to another episode of the 3 Wise Men of Divorce: Money, Psych, and Law. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe, leave us a review, and share with others who may be in a similar place. Until next time, stay safe, healthy, and focused on a positive, bright future. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Every family law case is unique, so no legal, financial, or mental health advice is intended during this podcast. If you need help with your specific situation, feel free to schedule a time to speak with one of us for a personal consultation.